Tonight, a program devoted to the issue of marriage equality. Lawmakers in New York spent this week deciding the fate of marriage equality with lengthy backdoor negotiations with the governor focused on legal protections for religious organizations. As recent polls now suggest a majority of Americans now support same-sex marriage, could this mark the dawn of a new era in marriage equality legislation all across the country? We'll be joined by Sean Eldridge of Freedom to Marry, Fox News commentator and author Margaret Hoover, and Tony Award-nominated Broadway star Rory. That's next on Give and Take. We begin the special edition of Give and Take on the phone with New York Assemblyman Daniel O'Donnell. The New York Assembly voted 80-63 in favor of the marriage equality bill, setting the stage for the vote in the New York State Senate. Assemblyman O'Donnell, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
As we conduct this interview, I'd like to point out to our viewers that the New York State Senate has yet to vote on the marriage equality bill. With that in mind, Assemblyman, how confident are you that this will reach the governor's desk for a historic signing?
Well, the Assembly has passed the bill on 4 consecutive occasions since 2007, and we never really had the momentum in the state Senate, and we never really had publicly committed yes votes like we do now. We have 31 committed yes votes, which means we just need one more senator to vote yes, and I think that's going to happen by the end of this week.
Now, Assemblyman, this has been a dream of yours and many of your colleagues in New York politics for many years. What made it possible to get this far this time around?
Well, there's a number of things that have changed. One, we have a governor who is committed. The previous governor, Governor Patterson, was as committed as Andrew Cuomo was, but didn't have the political power and the political popularity that Governor Cuomo has. So that's certainly a big part of it. Additionally, the polling has changed. Since I started this in 2007, we've gone from 42% to 58% of New Yorkers being in favor. And that's a very important thing, too. And thirdly, this year, for the first time in my entire lifetime, all the different disparate gay groups were all working in conjunction with one another. And that coordinated effort made things much more seamless, and so we were able to communicate, stay on message. We were able to contact elected officials, mobilize people out in the communities, and I'm confident that by the end of this week we're going to get this done.
There have been delicate negotiations between the governor and Senate Republicans about the issue of accountability of religious organizations that would choose not to provide services to same-sex couples. By protecting these institutions, essentially immunizing them from legal and other consequence, wouldn't we be perpetuating discriminatory behavior that would assuredly be unacceptable with respect to any other civil right?
I can assure you that is not what's going to happen. That would not be acceptable to this governor, to my speaker, or to me, or to the people in the governor's office who are working on this language. The reality is a marriage license has nothing to do with discrimination laws, has nothing to do with adoptions, has nothing to do with those things. And yet people have raised fears that there's a connection between those two things. When the bill was originally drafted in 2007, I insisted that it contained specific, clear language that says no clergyman or minister or rabbi is required to solemnize a marriage because of this law, and that is in the bill. However, in this latest round, Governor Cuomo, when he submitted his program bill, included language that came directly out of the human rights law that said certain organizations and entities are, by their definition, exempt. So, for example, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, or the Catholic War Veterans, or the Jewish War Veterans, those entities are exempt from the public accommodations human rights laws because they're private entities. And so, clearly, this governor and I would never turn back the clock and write discrimination into our statutes. We're just going to make sure that it's clear that this is not designed or intended or will interfere with anyone's free exercise of their religion.
Well, Assemblyman Daniel O'Donnell, thank you so much for joining us on Give and Take today.
It was my pleasure.
Now joining us is Sean Eldridge, Political Director of Freedom to Marry, and Margaret Hoover, Conservative Commentator. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So let me start with you, Sean. What would a victory in New York mean to your national efforts to legalize same-sex marriage in every state?
Yeah, well, it would be an enormous step forward in so many ways. First of all, we would more than double the population of Americans who live in a state that has the freedom to marry, and that on its own would help so many families, so many same-sex couples who are in loving, committed relationships, who have been waiting for this day, who are craving the respect and the personal significance of marriage. And many of the families also really badly need the critical safety nets of rights and protections that marriage would bring to them. So it would be an enormous step forward. And it would also be a bipartisan victory. So it would send a clear message to the nation that the freedom to marry the person you love isn't a Democratic value, it isn't a Republican value, it's an American value.
Now, there are over 40 states in the union that have not legalized gay marriage. Is that a surmountable number in your opinion?
I think it is. I mean, we have seen in many struggles throughout history that some states lead, and then eventually you have to have a federal and a national resolution. I think it is surmountable. I think the really important figure is 53%, and that is the number of Americans who now support the freedom to marry across the country. So Americans, conservatives, Republicans, young and old, are thinking about this issue. They're looking at their gay friends and neighbors and co-workers, and they're realizing that they deserve the same freedoms, the same protections, and the same respect as everyone else. So I think with majority support behind us, I'm confident that we can win this nationwide.
Now, 37 states have statutory defense of marriage acts. How much does that complicate your mission?
Well, it is certainly hurting those families in those states that are looking to protect each other and their families in these tough economic times. But I think, again, with 5 states, plus now this potential victory in New York and the District of Columbia with the freedom to marry, the wind is clearly at our back. And I think that there are certainly ways that we can win more states, that we can knock down federal marriage discrimination. And so we're confident that momentum is with us, that the right side of history is the freedom to marry.
Now, Margaret Hoover, you're making the conservative case for marriage equality, and recently you wrote an op-ed in the Daily News that was even quoted by Mayor Bloomberg. Make that case for us today.
So I think there are 2 main points. First of all, marriage is a conservative virtue because marriage is the fundamental societal stabilizer throughout human history, through every culture. When 2 people wed together and make a commitment to one another throughout the course of their lives, that creates the fabric that is the societal stabilizer throughout every single culture. We want to encourage people to create those commitments to one another because that makes our entire culture across the board, every individual, regardless of sexual orientation, allowed to be part of that thing that makes our culture strong, stable, committed, a strong foundation. The second part is a limited government argument. And it's not just a sake of argument. Look, when people take care of each other, they're grounded in self-sufficiency. They don't need to rely on federal assistance, state assistance, other people to take care of them because they're committed to taking care of one another.
Is it difficult, though, for you as a Republican to know that most of the political opposition to marriage equality is coming from the right side of the political aisle?
No, it's not difficult. And in fact, it's funny. Sean said, the way we win this battle is that we have certain states. There have always been throughout the course of history certain states who have led the battle. And the reality is in New York has always been a leader in the cause of individual freedom. The abolitionist movement, William Seward, really got wind in New York. When he was governor of New York, he was a senator of New York. He was also the first presidential candidate on the Republican ticket from New York. Ardent abolitionist. Frederick Douglass, abolitionist newspaper in Rochester, New York, the North Star. Also, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the suffrage movement in the United States, founded in New York, in Seneca Falls. So New York actually has a very strong legacy of supporting individual freedom. And by the way, that is grounded in the Republican Party. So actually, the reality is I'm more consistent, and New York Republicans are more consistent with a historical legacy of individual freedom, and New York really has an opportunity to lead the cause once again in that fight.
So I want to get both of your takes on some comments that were made by Jay Carney, the White House spokesman for President Obama, talking about the president's views on marriage equality. Now, Mr. Carney said that the president is, quote, clear about the fact that his position is evolving, unquote. Sean, what does that mean? And does it offend you that the president of the United States is not taking a position on marriage equality?
Yeah, it doesn't offend me that he's evolving. I mean, if we look at the history of this issue, if you look at where a majority of Americans were in the mid-1990s when they were asked, do you support the freedom to marry? Only 20-some% of Americans supported the freedom to marry in the 90s. Now that number is 53%, a majority of Americans. So Many people are evolving on this issue, and the freedom to marry is not a topic in which we can call people a flip-flopper for changing their mind or call them inconsistent, because frankly this is an issue in which people are looking at their friends and their neighbors and their gay colleagues and thinking about the respect and the freedom that they deserve, and they're also thinking through their own values and where they stand on this, and across the board they're coming out in support of the freedom to marry. So if the president is evolving, so have a majority of Americans, and I think he's heading toward the freedom to marry, but it is taking too long, and it is time for him to show real leadership on this issue. It's time for him to come out in support of the freedom to marry, and we're hoping that will happen sooner rather than later.
Margaret, don't you think he's going to have to take a position? If New York State passes marriage equality, which is expected to pass here, isn't this going to put real pressure on him to finally take a stand on this issue?
Well, he's certainly going to get a huge amount of pressure from his base. They're especially looking for things to galvanize the base as he goes into the 2012 re-election. But look, at the word evolving, frankly, I think is deeply offensive, especially given the fact that when he was a state senator in Illinois, he was in favor of marriage equality. So I think people are forgetting his history, that he's actually been in favor of marriage before, and now he's not, and now he's evolving towards it. So unlike what you've described, Sean, which is the course and the trajectory that the majority of Americans are on, which is understanding that their friends and their relatives who are gay ought to have the same privileges and rights that they have as heterosexual individuals. President Obama isn't even on that trajectory, but he's pretending he is, because he actually in the past has been for same-sex marriage. So, I think it's a bit hypocritical. He's really not leading on the issue, and I think his base would certainly like him to, and frankly, Republicans are leading on the issue in a way that even President Obama isn't.
So do you predict that he'll take a position then, both of you?
I predict that he will come out in support of the freedom to marry. I can't speak for him about when that will happen. I think that as a majority of Americans make their position clear on this, and as more and more states move toward marriage, I think we're going to see leadership from the White House, and I think we're going to see it from Republicans. I think the country is all moving in that direction.
Let's talk about the religious exclusions, because this has been a hot-button issue here in New York, with a number of state Senate Republicans saying they will not vote in favor of marriage equality unless there are clear exemptions for religious institutions. Sean, how do you feel about that?
Well, this is an important question because there's a bit of confusion around this issue. What we're talking about here, a bill that would bring the freedom to marry to New York, we're talking about civil marriage. We're talking about marriages that couples go down to City Hall and get. And what's important to keep in mind is that if we pass a civil marriage bill, no mosque, no church, no synagogue is going to be required to perform any marriage that they don't want to. They're not going to be required to open their place of worship for the ceremony. Religious freedom would remain intact if we provide civil marriage to same-sex couples. And that's a really important distinction. And the bill that will pass in New York, we hope, will just clarify that. It will clarify that we can have civil marriage for same-sex couples while keeping religious freedom intact.
How important an issue is that to Republicans, Margaret?
Enormously important. It's enormously important. Look, every Republican in this state, every worshiping Catholic, every observant Jew, every religious Muslim needs to understand that their place of worship will not be forced to marry same-sex couples if that is not within the view of their religion. And that this law will have absolutely nothing to do with how they practice their religion or what their place of worship will be forced to do.